Greetings, and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today, on Sorcery Self-Defense, we are going to be speaking about the concept of obfuscation, starting with personal obfuscation and the idea of invisibility. Now, there are several methods out there claiming to grant the ability of invisibility. There are meditations one can do that supposedly give one the ability to bend light so that your image is not reflected. And there are ancient grimoires where if you could find all of the ingredients, claim that upon completion of the spell, create talismans that grant one invisibility, and several other old methods from folklore. Now, I have tried several of these methods myself, and I have investigated the idea quite thoroughly. However, with no irony intended, at this time, I am unable to report that I have ever seen proof of invisibility. Okay, so where will we start then? Let's start with the idea of being unseen. How to be unseen or pass unseen, which is the intent behind invisibility. The reason we want to be invisible is so that we can do things or be places without being seen. So, how does one achieve this? With obfuscation. There is a spectrum of how one can achieve obfuscation, and I have tried several of these methods with some success, some more than others. But let's start on the obvious end of the spectrum, which is blending in. When one is trying to become as unseeable as possible. So, let's start on the very end of that spectrum. And we are trying to hide. There is, of course, sigil work that one could do on this. Simply, I am unseen. Use those letters to create a sigil. And in this case, I think you would probably want to draw the sigil on yourself or create an amulet that you would wear when the sigil is in operation. One could also use camouflage paint. And simply applying camouflage paint, the proper colors of the camouflage paint, in and of itself will, of course, help one to remain unseen. But if you apply those with intent, focusing on how they will help you to remain unseen in the area that you are trying to hide in, it will help even more. In fact, if one is hiding in the darkness, I have knowledge of a type of smoked ash that one can use. It is mostly burnt leaves. It's actually a proprietary blend, but it is primarily burnt leaves from a birch tree and ingredients like that that are mixed together with dirt and placed on the skin. You don't want to make it a cream. You want this to be a very light thing, not making oneself extremely dark, but simply light, gray. Keep the skin from being lighter than the area around you. Like I said, you don't want to make it dark, because if you don't want to actually make yourself darker than the night, because then you become a silhouette. But beyond that, you want to be adding intent into the ashes as you make them. And that's actually the most important part of it, even though I can't technically tell you the ingredients. The important part is that while you are grinding the ash and the dust together, that you focus on the idea that it is going to obscure your image. And of course, these type of things work if no one sees you move. If anyone is looking at you, you need to be holding still. Making eye contact can immediately blow one's cover in these type of situations. You don't want to look directly at anyone. You don't want to move. And the trouble with this is that if you have been seen, now you stand out, because you're covered in camo or dirt or whatever it is. Once you've been spotted, you are now more easily seen than if you hadn't painted yourself. Okay, so this only works if you're holding still. What if you want to move? There are methods for this as well. Now, what I didn't mention in the holding still, and that will work there, but also when one wants to move, you can focus on the idea of your surroundings. Simply focus on the vibe, for lack of a better term, of your energy, of the area, and try to match your energy to that. And this helps when you're holding still as well, actually imagining that you were part of the trees or bark that you're pressed up against in your camouflage, or with the shadows that you were standing in. You want to, of course, keep yourself pressed into the shadow as deeply as possible, but you want to imagine that you are becoming with the shadow. You want to visualize yourself becoming part of the shadow and try to move. Once you do begin this idea, you want to move with the flow of the scene that you were in. You need to begin to learn to feel the vibe. Now, if you are moving, the important part here, especially if you are moving in the presence of others, is not to sneak. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if you seem to be sneaking, then this draws attention. We all notice when somebody tiptoes or whispers, yeah? It's the same when you try to sneak. So if you are moving through a setting, you want to move as if you belong there. You can't hesitate. You can't show nervousness. You can actually get away with this concept moving around people, even in places you're not supposed to be, if you simply move as if you belonged there. Simply keep going. Don't hesitate. Act as if the people aren't there, as if you were unconcerned with their presence. And often, you can move through places where you would think you would be stopped. And this, while not invisibility, is a type of obfuscation that will allow you to pass. Okay, so let's keep on with this idea of flowing with the rhythm. Well, before we get to that, actually, let's talk a little bit more about the visualizations. I talked about blending in, imagining yourself being moved into blending into your surroundings, trying to replicate the vibe of the place within your aura. This sounds complex, yeah? This sounds hard. Some people aren't able to quite understand that concept. Now, the more you can do this directly, the more effective I have found it to be. But if you are having trouble with this concept, one can imagine a cloak coming over top of oneself. And if you are unable to match it to the vibe, simply you imagine it as a mirror that is reflecting the energy around you. And I have seen this be quite effective on its own. You simply imagine the mirror cloak around you and that it is reflecting the image around you. You can also imagine yourself being smaller and smaller and smaller so that you are insignificant. You are small, tiny. You can imagine yourself even being translucent. I haven't had much success with imagining myself to be translucent, but the mirror cloak, as I called it, is quite effective. And imagining oneself to be small, I have had effect with that. That seems to work best at long distances, like crossing a field when there are people watching you without being unseen. You still want to keep to the silhouettes and off the horizon, of course, as best you can, but if you imagine yourself small or reflective and move without hesitance, this will help immensely, especially if you can't be sure when the person is looking at you. Okay, so, but now let's get back to this idea of moving with the flow. As you're doing either one of those concepts, imagining yourself blending in, the mirror cloak becoming smaller, any of these concepts, as you were doing them, if you were moving, you want to learn to move with the flow. There is a rhythm to the way every scene feels, an inner flow and rhythm that everything is connected to. As you move, you want to try and feel into that rhythm. Now, we go back into this concept of invisibility at this point. When one is moving with the rhythm, walking with the flow, this is where we begin to learn to feel for what is known as the human blind spot. There has been a lot of theory trying to debunk this idea, but the way that the human eyes are set up, we all have a blind spot in our vision that our perceptions simply edit out. There's a small chunk of area that we simply don't see, and rather than putting a hole in our vision all the time to annoy us, our brain edits out that small area and presents a whole picture to us. So as we are learning to move within this rhythm, that is how we begin to learn to sense that blind spot that our brain edits out and begin approaching back into this idea of invisibility. Now, that we have discussed this idea of the brain editing out certain patterns, that is a perfect segue into the other end of the spectrum of obfuscation. Our minds have what Peter Carroll called the psychic sensor. This is something our subconscious does with all the perceptions that we perceive. It tries to edit out things that are unlikely. Most of the time, we're fighting with this psychic sensor when we're casting spells. We're trying to push it away, trying to shut it up, shut it off, so that it doesn't edit out the supernatural incidences in our lives. In this particular case, rather than avoiding our own psychic sensor, we're trying to set off someone else's. So, in this case, we are trying to be absurd. Spell work is a great part of this. You want to cast spells that have a outlandish vibe. Not one to make you be seen, but one to make you be absurd. Make your energy as strange as possible. Because these things are edited out. It is theoretically possible that one could get away with walking right through a church if you were to be dressed in a gorilla suit with this concept. I'm not saying for sure that it would work. It would take quite a bit of courage or faith in this idea to put on a gorilla suit and just go walking through a church. But there it is. There's why. That's so strange. Now, imagine this is happening. If one person sees it, and if they look over and the person next to them isn't reacting immediately, they're going to suspect that they are seeing something, and maybe everyone there notices it, but nobody acknowledges it, and pretty soon they forgot. In fact, I have had an experience like this myself. I live in Utah, far away from anywhere where an ostrich might naturally occur. There was one time I was coming back from somewhere with some family of mine, and we're going down the road, and I look over, and there's an ostrich running down the side of the highway. And I looked over at the ostrich, and I thought to myself, well, that couldn't really be there. I looked over at my uncle that was sitting next to me, and he was looking at it too, with the same look on his face. And if I hadn't been sure he was looking at it too, I might not have said anything. And there you go. Now, like I said, I did say something, and he had been looking at that ostrich for quite a while with the same thought on his mind. If I had not spoken, the spell, if you want to call it that, would have not been broken, and neither one of us would have admitted to seeing that ostrich, and it would have passed unseen, or at least unacknowledged. We can push this concept of the absurd, and the more unlikely it seems to work, the more likely it is that it would. The more likely that it seems like, oh man, that would really cause a scene, that would really draw someone's attention. Well, as long as no one says the emperor has no clothes, if you'll forgive the metaphor, I'm sure you've all read the story. Everyone pretended the emperor had clothes until the little boy said something. And that's the same concept that you're working with when you're pushing the absurd so that you can pass unseen. Okay, so we have already gone quite a ways here. I think that will be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. And don't forget to join us next time, where I will be getting back to the Sorcerer's Shadow Volume 1 playlist. Until then, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.